Welcome back to the Running Man Self-Regulation and Self-Improvement Podcast with Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology. And what we'll be discussing today are going to be two things really that are very, very important as foundation to understanding really useful self-regulation skills, but also things that are helpful whenever things get very stressful. And I will explain these as we go. But the first thing we're going to do is discuss what is called, the hemodynamics of cognition, a big old term that means very simply how the blood flow moves through the body. And not just during stress, but during even fun times when we're just jumping in the bouncy house, having a good time. This is something that affects us, and our cognition is always in flux, not always at apex peak, highest performance, highest level of our capacity, IQ capacity that's available at all times. It just depends on how physically active we are. So the hemodynamics of cognition, we're going to address that as being the blood flow to the brain. The prefrontal cortex in particular is the one that's probably impacted the most when stress happens, because it's also the one that is least needed whenever, not that we don't need it at all, because it is there, it doesn't disconnect completely, but least needed in a survival situation when we're in reactive mode, whenever our lower levels of brain take over and improve our chances of organismic or individual self-survival, depending on the severity of the situation. So the hemodynamics of cognition, to start with the term, hemo, of course, means blood, dynamic, having to do with the movement, the active movement of the blood throughout the body, indicates what's going on under stress in particular, which is going to be our focus today, but also the fact that it's always in flux, it's always moving, depending on whatever level of stress we may be experiencing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a traumatic or dangerous event. It can be one that's very exciting, like seeing a motocross race or jumping in the bouncy house. We're at a birthday party having fun. Where there's physical activity of the body, we're going to have a marginalization of our best cognition. And yes, that is terrible English. I do it on purpose, and my poor English teacher is probably rolling over in her grave at this point. But bless her heart, she did teach me how to speak well for the most part. I'm very grateful for that. Now, back to the hemodynamics of cognition. Whenever we're discussing stress in particular, heart rate is elevated. Also, there's a change in breathing. And we also have a whole suite of other physiological things that go on. These are things that we'll mention more in detail, but I will just mention them in passing to give us a little context and to point out that even though we're focusing on the blood flow and how it affects our thinking under stress, that there are other things going on in particular that need to be understood as happening simultaneously and not in any particular order per se. Now, if you speak to a physiologist, it will tell you what happens first. But we're talking fractions of a moment that we ourselves many times won't be able to differentiate, but whenever we rewind the tape, so to speak, remembering what happened after the fact, we will be able to tell what aspects or what symptoms may have occurred as a result of stress and how we responded after the fact. So to start off with, whenever we have, let's say, a large measure of stress, we have a surprise or a shock, or somebody jumps out from behind a wall and gives us the boo, and we shriek and shudder, and our body goes into protect itself, and therefore we shell up, and even our shoulders hunch, and we might even startle and jump a little bit, might even freeze or run, maybe even scream. But whenever these things happen, it's very sudden, very quick. But often we will have blood flow going to the surface of the skin. We may flush. We may see somebody's face turning red. Also, we may note the difference in breathing, in that the breathing seems a little labored, in that we're trying to suck wind, almost like we can't breathe enough. Part of that is having to do with the heart rate trip hammering and speeding, and maybe even beating much harder wherever the blood volume is getting pushed in the direction of the skeletal muscles. That, and I'm going to use this term in particular moving forward, a default the blood flow must go to the skeletal muscles. Now, I'm not saying 100% perfect, all of it, because that would leave our brain without anything, and therefore we would, as a result, probably pass out, but that's not the case. The lower brain structures maintain blood flow. The prefrontal cortex, that's a part that we reason with, that we do our ABCs and 1, 2, 3s with. That's our math and reasoning and our if and then thinking, wherever we can think in time, in the sense if I do what I did yesterday, today, man, tomorrow is going to be really good, or it could suck. So in that vein, whenever we have our fullest blood flowing, we have our ability to reason and be able to time bind, so to speak. We can think forward back in time versus experience the immediate right now. Now, I will say this is a qualifier depending on level of stress. There's also a level of think, and yes, I'm saying that wrong on purpose, or level of consciousness that occurs that tends to resemble or reflect the level or state of arousal that we're in. We'll speak about vigilance and hypervigilance here shortly without getting stuck in the term. But whenever we are in stress, our way of thinking tends to be colored or filtered through that feeling. Mind you, I am saying feelings, because these are things that result in our body as a method of coping with whatever stressors in our environment are occurring. Now, feelings are the emotional aspect that happens in the midbrain. That's a lower level of brain than the prefrontal cortex, and it's very fast. Much of what we know, that moment to moment, even before we think, we tend to have a feel about things. We tend to feel before we're actually able to do higher cognitive process and thinking and our reasoning and rationale. Some say, well, I'm very rational. Well, put somebody in the right amount of stress and you're going to feel first before you think. So don't get so high on your prefrontal cortex. We tend to overvalue it, and we like to think that we're smart, and that's okay. We can be as smart as we want to be, but whenever it comes to stress, it doesn't matter how intellectually superior you may think yourself to be, or maybe you actually are. Not knocking you really smart folks out there, but we all default to a much more basic way of doing and thinking that is reactionary. Our thinking becomes simplified by default as a result of the blood flow moving, because we're moving from a more hedonic perspective. That means we're trying to avoid pain, move towards pleasure, and moving away from pain can be considered a form of pleasure, I guess, because if you've ever been hurt and if the pain stops, but it's not really like a super high peak experience, fun pleasure, but yet there's no pain, that would be in comparison pleasurable. And I think we'd rather have that than have pain. But back to the other things that occur whenever we are under stress is that not only does heart rate move upward, but our breathing changes, but our body temperature goes up. That's a sympathetic nervous system response, meaning our spine has awakened to those things that make us warm and increase blood flow, so that way we don't hurt ourselves in the immediacy of a situation that may require us to move really fast. So we have to warm our muscles to do that, and that kind of automatically happens. We don't think ourselves into a warm-up like we do before we're running a sprint. We just kind of automatically get it. That's why it can feel kind of overwhelming, because it's a huge rush of blood flow to different areas of the body, but more so to the skeletal muscles. And I'll explain a little bit about that. Whenever the blood flow does go to the skeletal muscles, we need that. We have to be strong. We have to be fast. I need to be able to run, jump, climb, strike, avoid what it is that's trying to prey upon me, if that is the case, or running away from the rock slide, whatever it might be. The thing is, we need to be able to be strong and fast. We don't need to be really smart. We just need to be able to recognize at what we'll call the gist processing level, understanding, okay, that's dangerous, don't be near that. Could be a Gila monster, could be a snake, could be a spider. And whenever we move away from that, we are actually encouraging our survival, organismic survival. And it isn't a perfect process, because you could go from the frying pan into the fire, in the sense that you could trip and fall and hurt yourself worse than what that little spider would have done to you anyhow. But in light of what we're talking about, the idea is to move away from things that are dangerous or potentially poisonous or injurious or can threaten our livelihood, so to speak. So, in the sense of there being a predator, if I'm feeling like a bologna sandwich, the environment around me, my external environment, is suggesting to me that maybe I need to get moving. I need to be not here. I need to be over there. And some of the other symptoms that go along are visual narrowing. We tend to hear people discuss panic, PTSD, anxiety attacks, and whenever there's a recall of a traumatic event, that there's a narrowing of their vision to what would be essentially the end of a moderate-sized coffee can, about 4 to 8 inches in front of their nose and face in diameter, so not really broad. So our visual capacity is more focused on what can I see clearly moving forward, and we have to be looking forward when our heart is racing, when we're running, because we need to know where we're going. We don't need to see to our periphery, to our sides. That tends to fall away. It doesn't get erased, it just gets narrowed severely. And often when that happens, we might see people turning over their shoulder, looking back, and people mistakenly call that, in quotes, paranoia, and it's not paranoia. That is wherever you see the symptoms of somebody not being able to see their fingers wiggling to their sides or over their shoulders without having to turn their head and turn their eyes, versus what otherwise would happen when they're relaxed. They'd be able to see those things in the periphery without trying at all, without turning head or looking to the left for their eyes, for instance. Another thing that occurs is that we become gross motor dependent. That means fine motor skill starts to fall away, where before, moments before, I might be able to pick up, not caveman rocks, but rather pennies and nickels off of a table with our fingertips. Now we have to slide them off the table into our palm, and it's a very uncomfortable feeling sometimes. Our hands may feel a little thick, almost like sausages, if you ever experienced that, and I have. And it's really funny because you try to do things that require minute, fine motor movement, and you can't. It's not anything that works really well. I used to work as an optician many years back, and the fine screwdrivers that we used to use, I never thought I'd be able to use them. Then finally, whenever I left doing that work for 8 years, I was able to really key in on the fine motor skill. I realized just how much fine motor skill we lose whenever our heart rate is up, whenever I've been doing drills, whenever I've been in self-defense situations, or whenever I've just been upset or angry, anything like that, just typical stuff, not excess. And it's enough to note the difference in our ability to, or inability, more correctly, to do fine motor things. So those are some really telltale signs that have to do with self-awareness, but they all kind of happen at once. Most of us paying attention are more apt to pay attention to those things that are relative to what my narrative is when I'm trying to respond and recall what happened. So back to the hemodynamics of cognition. After all this symptomology, you don't have to remember all this, but these are things that I will be bringing up over and over because they all kind of happen together, and the direction we're going is always going to lean on this stuff, especially what we're talking about today. So the hemodynamics of cognition, once again, have to do with the blood flow and the amount of blood flow that is shunted away from the prefrontal cortex. It hypothetically gets not bone dry, but evacuated, because whenever we are in fight-flight, that's not the only organ that gets evacuated. Also our intestines and our stomach. Whenever we're safe, moments before, we are in technically what we would call friend and befriend mode, and we might be resting and digesting and thinking about what it is that we're going to do to make a better spear tomorrow. If we were cave people a long time ago, we'd be sitting around shooting the breeze with our cave person buddies, eating, maybe having a piece of some really fatty meat that's very satisfying. And once we get to that point, we are actually relaxing, and our assumption of safety is met at that point. And we're able to use our highest capacity cognition, fine motor skill, for shaping that spearhead, and also for tying to a nice straight stick. All of those things are working really well until the stress occurs. Once the stress occurs, often if you ever speak to anybody that has told you what it felt like when there was a sudden onset acute stressor, fear, shock, or pain, like I dropped a rock on my foot, this sort of thing, the blood flow very quickly leaves the stomach and intestines. Often people's descriptions are, it felt like I got punched in the stomach. Some people actually vomit. There are some that even evacuate their bowels because of the shock factor. But the blood flow leaving the intestines and stomach often is part and parcel to exercise. Whenever you see somebody lifting weights, doing bodybuilding and they're flexing in the mirror, and to use the common term now, they get swole. Well, where do they get the swole from? The blood that comes from the intestine and stomach is one, and it goes to the skeletal muscles by default because those are what are being used as the priority. Even whenever it's not stressful, like exercise, it has to go to your muscles so you can get the benefit of that exercise. So they are going to be larger in volume for a time, and it goes back, and you lose the pump after that. But the brain is one of the organs that gets evacuated during stress and even during exercise. There have been studies done where people have been asked to run around on a track, and they hand them a clipboard, here, do simple 1 + 1 math. And it takes them more effort. Part of the reason is that our IQ is dependent as far as using it. It is crystallized and it is housed in the brain itself. But the blood flow carrying glucose to do the process we call thinking is required. And if you have very little resident blood flow carrying that sugar that's in enriched blood, then thinking becomes very difficult. Now, you can't get it back by trying to do processes such as, if you have the luxury of doing some math or reading something that requires a higher cognitive process, it starts coming back because then that becomes the priority. But during a stressful state, or even whenever we're jumping in the bouncy house having fun, being able to do calculus or math isn't priority whenever your body's priority is to be able to generate force to jump in the bouncy house, to be able to generate force to run, fight, and climb. So keeping this in mind, whenever we're physically moving, our cognition, generally speaking, is marginalized. There are some people that I speak to that say, well, whenever I go walking, I do power walking, I think the best. Well, often when we do that, we're actually able to think in a more linear, singular sense versus doing the shotgun multitask effect. So in essence, you're kind of short-circuiting what you're calling your capacity to do multitasking a little bit, but that also allows you a little more of an opportunity to focus more effectively on problem solving in the singular sense. So there is a measure of clarity that comes with it to a certain point. Once you get past about 110 beats a minute, once again, that's an average, not perfect for everyone, and it'll vary depending on general health and fitness. Then we're moving into what's called stress inoculation, that many of our first responders and military have to learn how to think under stress. But even they know at a certain point, when you get to what we will call full tilt boogie, whenever it's on, and it's real, and you're at risk for being injured or there is a threat of injury, and it's compelling enough that you not only feel but believe it's coming, that's whenever the cognition goes the route of what we'll call binary thinking. One of the symptoms that occurs, binary meaning black, white, up, down, very concrete thinking. And that means it's overly simplified. That's whenever we start getting closer to just processing, or what we'll call our approach avoid hedonic approach reasoning, approach avoid reasoning to be more accurate. Whenever we go there, that's whenever we start seeing the effects of blood flow. Now, we're going to speak about IQ for a moment, just to bring things into a more complete idea before we finish up with this podcast, and that's going to be that global average of IQ, everybody and their mom mashed together, averaged together, even including those of the highest capacity, such as Miss Marilyn Vos Savant, and those that are barely measurable and barely on scale, that are profoundly cognitively impaired. Whenever we're averaged together, we have about 100, 105. That's not changed a whole lot in the last maybe 60 years. And I'm going to tell you that there are those that think that we're much more intelligent at a younger age because of electronics, and I would disagree with that a little bit. Now, we have access to things that help us become more functional, but I don't necessarily think that our IQ has jumped as a result of that, such that it'll impact the global average. But here we are, back at the global average, 100 to 105. Most people fall within that range. There are some that fall above that, some that fall slightly below, and some that fall way below, and that's just something to keep in mind. But that IQ has to do with what we experienced and what we know and remember. That's our crystallized IQ. And that's what's measured with an intelligence test, so to speak. And The reason this is really important is that whenever we're at our fullest capacity is whenever we're least stressful, whenever we're in the least amount of stress. Now, some would say test anxiety. People can still do their best thinking under that kind of stress. And I would say no. Test anxiety actually marginalizes what we have access to because we're treating it like an environmental, physical, outside of myself, physical threat. Even though we're not thinking it that way and we know that no one's trying to hurt us, our body's responding to it as if. And those are things we'll discuss more in the future as well. The important thing is that whenever we do stress, our IQ drops. On the average, for an average stress, I'm getting worried because, oh no, they're going to turn off the light or the water. I didn't pay that or forgot to pay it. Or for some reason, I got a traffic ticket or somebody frightened me. They jumped out from behind a wall and thought it was funny, and now they scared the living crap out of me, so to speak. Now we're talking about an average stress. No injury, just stress. Could be a spat, an argument, could be a disagreement, could be fear of having lost the keys to the car and I've got to be at work, this sort of thing, but nothing life-threatening. But yet, we are talking about an average loss here, and we have a drop of IQ of about 10 to 14%, which comes out to about 10 to 14 IQ points off of the 100 to 105 global average. Now, the FBI uses this information as well, and they're aware of it, but they also know that whenever people are in extremes of stress, if I do drop that rock on my foot, or I am physically injured, or if I am in shock or somehow terrified, that number goes up. That percentage can go up to 30%. 30% out of 100 to 105, we're talking about a 75 or 80 IQ. This is when we really start seeing the results of cognitive errors, reasoning errors, that otherwise, whenever our blood flow comes back, bringing back our IQ, and we have that smack in my forehead with my palm moment, realizing that, oh God, I can't believe I did that. I wish I could have that back. We can fully visualize what happened and recall it, but yet in the moment we weren't able to make the best of the best decisions to benefit me moving forward, because we're in the right now, and the consciousness at the time is about making the right now a survivable thing and making it into the next right now. And the future orientation of my kids 10 years from now, based on the decision I made today, is not there. We're not able to do that. So blood flow does play a really, really important part in how we think relative to the level of stress. And there is a relative consciousness based on the level of stress or state of body stress, to be more accurate, whenever we're experiencing it. So as far as the hemodynamics of cognition, they change. And the more we can, in effect, mitigate or control the levels of stress we experience in our body, the better able we're going to be to make not only really good decisions, but also be able to recall and remember things and be able to be a little more able to discuss what's going on. Whenever things are not as stressful, we are able to more fully accommodate whatever it is our environment needs as far as information or those people that I speak to. We're able to develop rapport more effectively, and we're able to interpret facial and body language. Facial body language is very important. There's a really big movement in reading body language and things of this nature, and these are extremely important, but they are far from the only thing. The way they're being marketed now is like this end-all be-all, and it's not. It's an aspect of what happens to us, but it's a very important one. But one thing that underlies that is this level of stress and blood flow we're talking about, that whenever we are under a larger measure of stress, and if we have adrenaline in our system, chances are we do if we're stressed, there's something that happens whenever we have adrenaline in our system. We become very survival oriented, and our body starts responding by releasing glucose from the liver, from our survival energy stores. It burns a little dirty. We get a little irritable and angry, but we're able to do what it is we need to do. We tend to be very hyperfocal, but also may come off a little snappish and almost a little rude. But we are actually trying to get a meal, especially if it's due to hunger, I haven't eaten, this sort of thing. But if it's a shock or a surprise, there's something else that happens, and it usually stays within the body about 48 to 72 hours. And that's that we become very emotionally insensitive. Not that we don't feel or unable to feel, but rather we're unable to interpret the emotional body language that people are giving us, smiles, genuine, authentic smiles and behaviors of caring. We can't tell if somebody is looking at me with the baring of teeth whenever I'm in this adrenalized state. It's like a dog that's baring its teeth. A dog bares its teeth. What do? We go and want to hug the puppy, right? Probably not. And if you do, you probably need to go back to school and figure out what baring teeth really means. But it could be considered aggressive. Even though we know that we're socialized creatures, we still have that same programming that when we show teeth or bare our teeth, we may be gritting our teeth and may be tense when we do that. That indicates stress and maybe even contention or danger. And it's not so different from seeing a dog baring its teeth, for instance. So we respond to that very deeply. And it's a very subconscious thing. It's not anything that I can say, oh, Bob's baring his teeth at me. I think he's upset. I better not go over there. He may bite me. This sort of thing. It's not a higher cognitive process like that first. At the level that we interpret that is called the just processing level. It is very precognitive as far as it being not higher level prefrontal cortical thinking that we would call formalized reasoning, but rather it's more a reactive thing that determines fight flight. Is that the fight for me? Is he trying to eat me, or am I gonna have to eat it? Or can I eat him? Oh, that's not the fight for me, I better run. So these are the things that are underlying programmings that in very socialized settings we still respond to. So if somebody has had an adrenalized state happen and they're in it, they're generally unable to plug in. They feel, often the description is like there's been an invisible clear wall placed between them. I would say it's like plexiglass in the way I see it in my mind. That is placed between us, and whenever they smile, my first question might be, is like, what are you looking at? What are you smiling at? You laughing at me? It's a very self-centric, and it seems almost self-centered in the negative sense, but it's a very self-centric, self-preservation perspective, wondering what they may intend to do towards me, with me, at me, whatever, but it's not ever for me, because there's also the lack of ability to bond during this time. So oxytocin is not working so well. The bonding chemical that people are so enamored of now, it's not happening. It's not occurring. So that lack of bond makes things seem almost antiseptic and distant, and many people leave jobs, leave long-term relationships, and make really serious life decisions that later they regret because, in quotes, they're not feeling it. Well, no kidding, they're not feeling it, because if you have adrenaline, technically you're in survival mode, and you don't need feelings, nor do you need to be able to interpret socialized emotional behavior, because you should be running. You can do the social thing later. You can share bacon with somebody later. You can hang out and talk about the new spear later when things are safe. When your assumption of safety is met, you can do all those things more safely. But once that shock happens, we become very emotionally insensitive. It's not so much that we're not sensitive to it, it's just shut off. It's temporarily shut off. It comes back. The more we hang out with people, it starts coming back once our assumption of safety is met. But if we have a chronic recurrence of stress, and we have a chronicity of stress that appears to not go away, or it only goes away long enough for another one to come up a day later, and we're not down from the first one, then it starts to appear something that looks like trait behavior. Those are things that look like patterns to other people that are watching, things that appear to be personality quirks or traits that a person may have, when in actuality they're just really reactive, responsorial things that are going on in the body relative to the level of stress in the environment. So someone may seem like a real pain in the backside, but it may not even be that they're trying to be. It's just they're moving from a space of feeling very unsafe. This gives us a little room to have, one, empathy, but two, also compassion for another individual, because we do not know what they're going through. And we tend to be very quickly offended often when we see somebody upset because we tend to mirror the behaviors that they're giving off. So if they're smiling, the socialized smile, it's kind of a reflexive thing. We tend to reflexively smile back. That's part of our mirror neuronal structure. That if we appear like the group that is smiling over there, then I may be more apt to be accepted into it. When we're cave people, safety in numbers, and that's a really cool thing. And these are really deep things that are wired within us. There was a psychologist that was doing a little video recording of his wife having had a baby, and he was wanting to test a newborn baby that was literally just minutes old, less than 5 minutes old, probably about 2 or 3 minutes old. So they did the Apgar score on the baby, and the nurse hands him the baby in swaddling, and he has his cameraman compatriot in study recording over his shoulder, and this gentleman is facing his baby, his newborn baby, minutes old, literally minutes old, and he starts sticking his tongue out at it over and over, about 4 or 5 times, and then the baby starts sticking tongue out back at dad that's sticking his tongue out. Wow, how profound can that be? What's amazing about it is if we look at it in the context that, one, we're not a blank slate when we're born. We already come into the world with many bits of information that we garner while we're still in utero, but this baby was able to learn, socially learn, vicarious learning, Bandura's learning, saying that you don't have to necessarily be shown how to, you can just watch it and learn this way. So baby assumed the behavior of the tongue sticking out tribe. Now he's a little bitty version of the tongue sticking out tribe, but he looks closely enough to those that are grown that can do the tongue sticking out from that tribe in particular, that he just raised his chances of survivability because he looks like them. Do you think that was a conscious decision where baby said, I better look like them or else they're going to eat me or cast me out? Well, probably not. That's a deep neuronal thing that has to do with our survivability as a human organism and a human race for that matter. So this is some pretty deep stuff. So as far as the hemodynamics of cognition, that has to do once again with the blood flow affecting how we think based on the stress that we're experiencing in the environment, external environment. And our internal environment is not separate from the external environment. That's a very important thing to note. Our external environment has an impact on us, like the tongue sticking out tribe. That was baby's external environment. What was his internal environment doing? He was basically copying the behavior, mimicking the behavior, due to whatever signal he was getting on the inside of his little self, which is amazing. So there's no discontinuity, there's no separation of environment from outside to the skin and from the skin in. What goes on within the skin, from the skin inside environment, our endogenous internal environment, we impact our external environment. What goes on outside, whatever decisions we make or motivations we have to make or do or change things, it's not discontinuous. So if we look at things this way, we realize that we're really part of our larger environment, never separate, even though we may like to think that we are. Sometimes it's a comfort. Sometimes we wish we could unplug from the environment. And whenever we isolate and shut our door and put our headphones in and listen to music and try to shut the world out, what are we really doing? I'm not going to answer that question. That was rhetorical. But if you have an answer for me and you'd like to leave it in the comments once we post this podcast, I'd like to see what your comments are, because I'm really interested in what your thoughts are on this material. But also, I want you to have your thoughts relative to, well, how does this serve me? Now, my next part that I'll be discussing, and that's going to be it for the hemodynamics of cognition for now. We'll revisit that more as part of the bigger whole of this whole work that I'm doing with the Running Man self-regulation, self-improvement project. The goal is to be able to get skills, develop skills by doing certain drills so that way they stay with you. And the underlying mission statement of this whole project, and I will speak it to you, is that we be able to see through the veneer of social interaction. That is a powerful tool. that makes it sound almost conspiratorial, but I guess it kind of is. Maybe I'm a mad scientist in that sense, and that's okay. The thing that I'm mad about is the fact that, not mad angry, but mad crazy about, and I'm very impassioned about, is the fact that how we experience our world relative to our perception often is a little different person to person. But one thing that we share, we all do, is the neurology of being a human. And a human being isn't always optimal based on the stresses that people report and the stresses that we experience as individuals. And why do we need to look through the veneer of social interaction? That's a question that I'm going to ask you. I'll give you my answer as we go, but I'll start it as an incomplete idea today, and we'll complete it as we go. So why is it important to see through the veneer of social interaction? And this is my perspective. This is also largely coming from my experience, and also my opinion is that by seeing through the veneer of the social interaction, we see the real person. We don't judge by the behavior. And we define ourselves not by the things that we've done, good, bad, and different, nor should we judge someone else by the things that they've done, but rather see the real value of the human being, the real value of the person. That way we can extend to them and ultimately towards ourself love, compassion, patience, understanding, respect. All of these things, even whenever they're doing something that may not be respectable, maybe doing something that's really irritating, maybe they're doing something that might really, really make you feel angry. The reason I mentioned that is that when people act in ways that are aberrant and uncomfortable to us, we're judging them, but also if we think about them as being our mirror, if they are my mirror, what am I seeing in them that I have in me that makes me uncomfortable? Because you know how people say that people can't make you feel a certain way, you have to decide to let them, which really isn't even them, it's you deciding to have those feelings as a result of what's going on and getting attached to whatever that behavior was. We're not an organism full of push buttons, where you push a button, you get a certain item, like a cigarette machine or a Coke machine or a candy machine. Put your quarter in, press the button, get your item. But we tend to look at the way we respond that way, and I think it's largely incorrect. But mostly, it's engendered by media, those we grew up around. And it's time to sophisticate what we're doing, not make it complex, but rather get best effect with the most elegant and least intrusive way of doing things and the least intrusive tools and skills, so we can get a higher quality of life, better quality of life things in higher quantities. That's the goal. So by seeing through the veneer of social interaction means that we don't buy into what people are wanting us to think of themselves, especially when it's being generated from a place of fear. By having compassion and understanding, not calling them out, but instead just having understanding and patience and hearing them out. Because many times all we need is to have somebody hear us and understand us, for the stress to stand down when there's communication that is falling apart. Moving forward, we're going to be focusing on tools and how to recognize when things are falling apart, so I'm better able to avoid situations, change things in myself, and also recognize things in others, so that way I have time and distance. Distance by default, physical distance, is time given. That might be able to be useful to you in the sense that you might have a 60-second dead run before they catch you. But also it could be 60 seconds of an opportunity to say, you know what, we'll come back and revisit this whenever we're a little less upset. And we'll be moving in the direction of generative tools, elevating our peers, our brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers out there, and our children, co-workers, and our strangers that we don't know, that we meet out in the street. So on that note, we're going to close for today. I just want to say thank you for the time. Thanks for listening. And we'll be coming back with episode three very soon. Not through, but 3. And we'll be discussing perceptual speed and how that impacts the very things we talked about today. How our bestest of all intelligence gets derailed or marginalized as a result of stress, especially if it comes on really fast. And it can sometimes. All the best and take care. I appreciate your time.